Hello once again, everyone. So back by popular request, I will be talking a little bit more about the bayonet, and this will also be a good reference for my students for some particulars on what we're currently working on. So we're using an amalgamation of two systems, because frankly, in regards to the British Army, there isn't necessarily that much content on the bayonet. In fact, there's not that much content on the bayonet in general. And that is an important thing to remember, is that in regards to fencing, as we know, in regards to fencing systems, the bayonet is one of the simplest. Not that it isn't effective, not that it is rudimentary, but instead, you just don't need that much complicated stuff, because the instance in which you're using the bayonet is either I'm using it against someone who is not using a bayonet, and I've had to turn my shooty stick into a stabby stick, or alternatively, I am using my stabby stick against other people who have not had the chance to turn their shooty stick into a stabby stick, and thus, you don't really have a ton of back and forth or anything really outside of the bare basics. But there are two main systems of bayonet that we're working on. They're both under the umbrella of the British Army. Those being Angelo's system, which is what I showed last time, and now we're going to talk a little bit about Burton's system. Now Burton is an interesting character and he has a lot of interesting opinions, etc. But his bayonet is decently useful, and this comes off of wanting to give soldiers something a little bit extra to use. And this is not something he made up, at least according to himself, but instead has taken from test experience from either continental armies, which had sometimes more complex bayonet systems, the Germans and the French, for example, or alternatively from experience in India. But the main thing that I'm going to cover today is his 3 points, right? He has kind of 3 guards, and throughout of them 3 thrusts, and also 3 main parries. And those are going to look just a little bit different, so they can be very good to supplement your bayonet game. So first and foremost, of course, we're going to have just the standard front point, which is going to be exactly the same as we delivered it last time. You're in your charged position, weapon is held tight to you. It's just going to be your standard extension with the small lunge, bringing my right shoulder forward, hitting my target, and then retracting back into a charged position. But the first new one that Burton is going to give us is going to be the high point, or prime point. So from here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to raise the weapon above my head, and I want to keep my fingers underneath the barrel preferably. If I'm delivering the thrust, I can have them a little bit more extended, but he mentions in the parrying section that you want to be careful not to have your fingers on top, as you are about to parry with that part of the weapon. But I'm going to raise the weapon above my head so the lock is turned downwards, and from here I'm going to execute my first thrust. Now, important thing here, Burton describes merely extending the arms out to their maximum reach, and then also following that forward with the body, which would look like so. And this is a perfectly valid thrust. It will do its job. However, an alternative, even though he does not describe turning the lock downward, those that are more familiar with either thrusting from above, which is basically the same position if you're thrusting low, or from the shortened arm position, you may also find that occasionally you need to turn the weapon downward as you execute your lunge. Both are perfectly valid, and you probably need to do both depending upon the situation. But if I'm thrusting through a window or something along those lines, I might as well keep the weapon high. I could also do this if I'm directing my thrust upward, or downward for that matter. But sometimes you may wish to bring your shoulder forward with the same turning that we did when we shortened arms or thrusted low. So that's our first one. And it is noted that when you take this, your tip should be slightly off to the left. Now, our second point is going to be moving into carte. So he names this prime, carte, and tierce. Usually this is pretty standard small sword stuff that I won't really get into, but this is going to be pretty familiar for those of you that are used to such things. But carte is going to be a bit of a strange one, and most people will struggle with it a little bit. What carte is going to be is, now I'm going to be thrusting on this line, and so I'm going to align the weapon with my left breast. I'm going to turn my lock down. Now what this is that by aligning this in front of my breast is that I'm going to be able to use one side of my body effectively, as just the same that we were aligning with this shoulder, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. I'm going to be aligning it with this side, and you do want to be making sure that it's on the breast, that being this strip of muscle right here. It's not in my armpit, and it's certainly not on my sternum, as when you hit the target and it's in one of those two places, the stock is going to really make that hurt, versus if it is lined up against here, it is perfectly strong and quite difficult to set aside. Now the way I achieve this is that I am going to push my weapon forward and turn my hand inward. My left hand needs to open a little bit to accommodate, and we'll also shift slightly, so now I'm kind of almost holding it sideways, and I'm just going to bring it up so it locks against my body. And at the same time, I execute my thrust. So here's that from the front. Nice and strong. And you can see how kind of I put all my eggs in one basket in regards to this thrust, which is very good if I'm dealing with things on this side. Another note about this is that it does reach a lot further, and once you get used to this slightly strange motion, it's really not necessarily that difficult to pull off at good speed. You just got to make sure that you're locking it into proper position when you execute your thrusts. Something that I find will help with that a little bit is make sure to slightly let it slide forward in your hand, and also make sure to bring it to your breast as opposed to trying to stick it forward and bring it back in. Just bring it up into the level of. But that's going to be cart. And our final one shall be tierce. Tierce is going to be pretty much our standard front point, which is going to be from here. My lock is turned slightly inward, though he describes it as upward. But what I'm going to do from here is I am going to just extend out and bring my thrust in. So pretty much exactly the same as we did before. I'm bringing my right shoulder forward to solidify and angle in my thrust. Now, when you're first practicing these are relatively, they're not complicated, but they are difficult transitions if you've not thought about bringing your shoulder forward before, or changing lines in regards to a polearm, because the stock does afford something that you kind of have with other polearms, but not quite. What most people will be used to, especially if they come from a medieval system or another polearm, medieval or Renaissance, is couching, where you bring the weapon underneath your arm to make it solidified. However, since we have the stock, which has a literal butt to it, you can now lock it to the front of your body, which makes it far more effective. As such, you've got to learn this new way of kind of placing it where it needs to go. And at the same time, to get its effectiveness, you need to learn to turn the body as necessary. You do the same thing when you couch, it's just when you couch, you don't think about the fact that you're bringing this side forward. Same thing when I'm now bringing it up. I'm just pushing it forward so it locks against my body, which, when I'm running into someone, is going to be very, very important. I want all of my force going into them. I don't necessarily want that force rebounding back against me. But to practice these motions, you can take them in stages, which is what Burton recommends. So for example, here, I go to prime, I extend, and then I will lunge from here. Extend, lunge. So, prime, extend, lunge. Or if you wanted to do the turn down version, prime, extend, lunge. Prime, extend, lunge. And see how I'm taking time to lock myself into it as much as possible before I fire off of that back leg. Now let's look at cart. So, cart, lunge. Cart, lunge. Nice and easy. Again, solidified, boom, fire, return. And then over time, you will make it more one action. Now we'll look at tierce, tierce, lunge. Tierce, lunge. Tierce, lunge. Nice and simple. And what I recommend you do to get used to these is practice them on a dummy. I'm currently having my guys run loops, literally sticking the dummy while I stand behind it so I can watch the angle and see their transition. Once you practice these a little bit and you know how they feel, especially when you hit a target, you know what you're emphasizing. And with good practice and diligence, it will become natural to you. But that's going to be the 3 points from Burton. And the other things that he shows us are, of course, going to be the parries. He will also show us the lance point once again. Nothing terribly crazy there. The low point, same as we showed it. And I don't believe he shows us shortened arms. But either way, those are going to be the main couple. So for all you bayonet fencers out there, hopefully that's helpful. For my own guys, definitely keep practicing it. But otherwise, we shall talk about some more techniques another time.